Get going. Here we are, Ezekiel chapter 40 and verse 48. The whole thing we have been doing has been to get us to this point right here. Now, when you have a certain profession, you see everything through the eyes of that profession, right? You go to a doctor who's a surgeon, how is he going to want to fix everything? Surgery, right? You go to a holistic doctor like a chiropractor, he's always going to see the solution to be through a holistic practice of some sort that he does. People see things through the light of their experience and the light of their profession that's there. And so what is Ezekiel's job, or what did he want his job to be, and what should it have been? He was a priest. And he was of a priestly tribe, and he was ripped out right before he was supposed to start working. He was age 30, and 30 is when the priest would take over, and he's carried into captivity. And so as you read through Ezekiel, you see it, much of it through a priest's eyes. That's the reason he keeps bringing us back to the temple. Of course, he's writing inspired, but the inspiration is going through him and giving a color to what he's writing. So you have a lot of that inspiration which is coming across. So, of course, how are you going to finish the book? You're going to finish it with a temple. And it's going to be the greatest and best temple that there ever was, at least in his eyes. And so that's what you're going to see. Now, you haven't heard a lot of sermons, especially if you're of our fellowship. You've not heard a lot of sermons or had a lot of Bible classes on chapter 40 through chapter 48. And we'll discuss why that is. There's 4 views of how to understand what we're about to dig through. Very quickly, by the way. 4 views, okay? First view is the literal view. And that is the nation of Israel, when they come back, when they are restored, they need to rebuild the temple. And when they rebuild the temple, it needs to be according to these dimensions. I think there's 318 measurements given. And so that is the mindset of a lot of people. After World War II, many people felt terrible about the Holocaust, which they should have. And so in 1948, the UN, the United Nations, created the nation of Israel. That nation of Israel has no connection with the Old Testament nation of Israel. The Old Testament nation of Israel, you had to be able to trace your lineage directly back all the way to Abraham. And that's why you could go through Abraham and Jacob and everybody else. And that's why, as you're doing your daily Bible reading, you get to 1 Chronicles 5, and you're like, what in the world have I walked into? Those first 5 chapters are important because the people who came back from the exile needed to make a connection to prove who was a true Israelite and who wasn't. AD 70, when the Romans came through, they destroyed all the genealogical tables. And that's because its purpose was done. Jesus' genealogy is given to us in Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3. And so there's not a need for it anymore. So a person today who tells you they're Jewish probably is Jewish, but they can't follow their lineage back to be certified as they were in the Old Testament. But in 1948, the United Nations created the nation of Israel, and the idea that there needed to be Israel, God's people, and that idea which is there. Now, this temple does not fit the actual nation of Israel today. If you were to build this temple, first of all, you'd get a lot of Muslims upset. But second of all, it's too big to fit on the Temple Mount. And so you would have to take out much of the city of Jerusalem in order to build this temple. It's not a practical thing. The second interpretation, the John Hagee and other premillennial folks, is the dispensational view. And that comes from a reading of the book of Revelation that says that Jesus is going to dwell upon this earth for 1,000 years in Jerusalem, and then after that we'll all go up to heaven. And so the dispensational view, the premillennial view, is that this is where Jesus will reign for his 1,000 years, and this will be the literal temple which is built. Now, of course, that does not fit Scripture at all. Jesus is not coming back to this earth. He says in Matthew 24 that he's never going to return to the temple or the temple area. And we see that we will meet him in the air in the end when you read in your Thessalonian letters, and we'll be with him forever. Now, the third view is the church view. And the church view is, well, chapters 40 through 48 refer to the church. Because as you read in your New Testaments, you look in 1 Corinthians, you see that the Christian is the temple of God, right? And you read in Peter, we see that we are living stones in the house or the temple of God. And so you remember Christ and the apostles. Christ is the cornerstone and the foundation, and you see all that part going there. And so that's a view as well. Now, a lot of people in the Lord's church like that view because that's a view you need in Book of Revelation. In Revelation, John uses some of this as he's working on his revelation, but he changes it. In Revelation, that is absolutely the church, coming down from heaven as a bride adorned for her husband. When you read it here, some people in the church love it because they love the detail in worship and they love the detail in all the measurements and everything. And they like to point to that and say, okay, in the Lord's church, we must have precision obedience. Everything must be precise. We must speak where the Lord speaks. We must be silent where the Lord is silent. And we must have everything authorized by God. That view, though, of saying this is a church, you've got to be creative in order to pull that off. Now, the fourth view is this is symbolic imagery, and it's speaking of Israel returning from the captivity back there. Now, this view seems to fit the best, but it's got a lot of issues as well. Because the apocryphal or the imagery which is there that you'll see in Revelation and the end of Book of Daniel, it fits that idea and it fits Ezekiel's motive as he goes through it. But if you're just using imagery and nothing literal and nothing there, Ezekiel spends a lot of time measuring things for it not to mean anything. And so everybody has one of those four views or a mixture of those four views. Most people in the Lord's church will probably be somewhere between 3 and 4. This kind of refers to the church, and it also refers to Israel coming back in an idealized sense. God is going to be with his people again and restore his nation. And while there's not this literal temple which is there, what you see is God does bring his people back and restore them once again as a people. But each one of those views you've got to work with, and you've got to think through your mind exactly what you want to do with that, okay? Now, there's 4 physical temples in the Bible. No, we're not even talking about the Christian. The first temple is the tabernacle. And, of course, that's not a literal temple, but you see where Moses commands the people to build a tabernacle or a tent, and it follows Israel as they travel through the wilderness, and it follows Israel in Shiloh and that sort of thing until the time of Samuel and until the time of David. The second temple is Solomon's temple. And Solomon's temple, when it was built, was the largest building in the world. It was a good-sized, very impressive building. The third temple is Zerubbabel's temple. And Zerubbabel's temple is the one that was built when they returned back from captivity. It's hard to say percentage-wise, but it's about a third of the size of Solomon's temple. Remember, everybody cried when they saw it, who had seen the first one, because it lacked its grandeur. And you see where Ezra and others say, as a matter of fact, this temple is going to be greater. Why? Because a resident, Jesus, is going to walk through this temple. That's why it was going to be better. And the fourth temple is 3B, really. And that is when Herod builds onto Zerubbabel's temple to restore it nearer to the dimensions of what Solomon would have. So that's the 4 physical temples. All right? All right. Now there's 4 spiritual temples. Okay? The first temple, which you see, is Solomon's temple. Okay? And Solomon's temple was had great symbolism. It was covered with palm trees and pomegranates, and it was designed with its gold inlay to resemble the Garden of Eden. That's what the inlay of the whole place would look like. That's what you're looking back towards, bringing back the fellowship of God and man. The second spiritual temple, which you're going to see, of course, is Ezekiel's temple, and that's chapter 40 through 48, okay? And that represents the return of Israel back to the promised land. The third temple, and this may be 3a, 3b, once again, the third temple is the one found in the book of Revelation, which John tells us about in chapter 21 and 22. And 3b, the main temple, is the Lord's church. It's a temple of God, and it's also the individual Christian, depending on how you look at it. All right, a lot of information there. Everybody remember that? Keep up with that pretty decent? It's a lot of stuff happening in it. And man, here we go. So those are some of the things that you're going to look at and see as you go through all of that. Now, we're going to kind of go pretty fast as we go through these sections because there's about 2 or 3 spots that I really want to focus on and spend some more time working with. As you open up here in chapter 40, of course, as we go through here, you see I think it's 14 years, maybe. Yeah, it's about 14 years after the 586 BC, when Solomon's temple's been destroyed, Ezekiel receives this vision. And as he's called up in this vision, a man meets him. And let's see this man here. Let's look at chapter 40 and verse 3. He's a man whose appearance is bronze, and he has a line of flax, measuring tape, and he has a measuring rod in his hand, and he stands in the gateway. So here you see a man, and he's glowing like bronze. Now, if you'll remember earlier, this looks a little bit like some of the angels that were in the presence of God. And if you juxtapose it to the book of Revelation, remember it's an angel that gives John his tour, which is going through. And so as you go through there, notice verse 4. And the man said to me, Son of man, look with your eyes and hear with your ears, and fix your mind on everything I show you. For you are brought here so that I might show them to you, to declare to Israel everything that you've seen. And so they begin to go through the temple, and this man is going to show Ezekiel exactly the dimensions of this temple. And he says, I want you to remember this stuff because this stuff's important as he goes through. And so he goes through, and the walls on the outside of the temple of this temple, the walls on the outside are 10 feet high and 10 feet thick, which would be pretty massive walls at the time. And so you go through and you see all those walls, and of course there's an inner wall as well, and the gates are the same. So you get to see that. Now, real quick, there's some differences between this and Solomon's and Zerubbabel's temple. There's not a court of the Gentiles. There's not a court of the women. In fact, everybody is together. And then I want you to notice, and we're not there, but when we get there, I want you to notice, when you get to the temple, there's no people. In fact, there's no people anywhere through here. And Ezekiel lets the angel, or lets this bronze man go into the temple, but does not follow him. So there's some differences here between what a literal temple would be like and what Ezekiel is seeing. All right, so he begins going through, and he begins measuring everything, and he sees everything faces this, and the gate posts, of course, are 60 cubits high, and everything else as you go through. Let's skip down to verse 38. Okay? And as you get to verse 38, you see the priest rooms, and you begin running through the furnishings that the priests have, and you see how everything is set up. There's the 4 tables on one side, 4 tables on the other side, hewn stone designed where they can make sacrifices and all those different things. And as you remember that, you begin comparing it to Solomon's temple and Zerubbabel's temple. I want you to notice something again. There's no bronze laver. There are no table of showbread. There's no lamp, which is there. There's no great curtain, which separates the Holy of Holies from the holy place. All those things are gone. All that's there are just a bunch of tables at which they can prepare the sacrifices to be placed upon the altar. Now, a quick aside. When you look at the bronze laver, what does that represent? It represents Christ. As we are buried in him, we are cleansed, okay? You see the gold candlesticks. What does that represent? Jesus, again, because he is the light. You see the table of the showbread, if this is all in Solomon's temple, what does that represent? Jesus, right? Because he is the bread of life. When you see the altar, what does that represent? Jesus, because he is the great sacrifice for every one of us. You see the curtain, what does the curtain represent? Okay, there's a reoccurring theme. You remember if you're in a kid's class and they ask a question and you weren't listening, what's the answer? Jesus, okay? Now, if that's not the answer, the Bible is the other answer. Okay, so what does the curtain represent? Jesus, because that is what is our transition to get to God, right? And so as you go through in this Solomon temple, what you see is Jesus everywhere. When you come here, there's not the bronze laver, there's not the showbread, there's not the candlesticks. It's just tables. And it's tables where these sacrifices are going to be offered and they're going to be laid upon the altar. And we'll see later how often they're laid upon the altar and everything else. And we see the first mention of something. In charge of this are the priest of Zadok. Remember, every priest came through Aaron, right? The Leviticus 10, Nadab and Abihu, remember they were put to death. And then so the high priesthood came through the third son. And as you travel down, we come to Zadok. Now, we don't spend a lot of time in the Old Testament, so we're like, yeah, priest of Zadok, what does that matter? Who is that? You read in 2 Samuel, and you read over in Chronicles, this is the priest who was in charge during the days of King David. He was the one when Absalom was rebelling and kicked David out. Zadok went with David. David sent him back to be a spy, and he made sure David was able to come back. When David was about to die and Abijah was about to become king, Zadok went with Bathsheba and also Nathan, a prophet, and they made sure that Solomon would be king, which would follow into the line of Jesus eventually. They didn't understand that, but providentially, God used Zadok to convince David that Solomon needed to be king. So what Ezekiel is showing here is the holiness, if you will, of the priests who are here. All right, and we're going to come back to why that's important again. Now that's the reason we're flying through this so fast. Now in chapter 40, skip down to verse 48, and we begin entering into the temple. And the heavenly creature comes to the temple and he begins measuring the inside. They come into what's called the nave, which is the entrance. The nave of a church building is the large room where the ceiling has a curve. The nave architecturally doesn't work necessarily in this building because this is a metal building, but we do have a nave. See that curved area that's above us? That's why if a person is standing right here, everybody can hear what that person is saying. And if a person is standing in the corner of this room, it's very difficult to hear because that wall up there, the way it's curved, causes an echo and amplifies. So this is just the nave of the temple. Ezekiel goes to that point, but he doesn't go any further than that. Of course, it is a 3-story structure as he goes in, and it is 500 cubits wide and 500 cubits long. There's significance to that, but we'll cover that later if we have time to compare each one of the temples. And so you see the way all this stuff works together in all these things. Now, here's a spot we're going to spend a little bit more time. Turn to chapter 43. Ezekiel 43. And we get to this point. We're at the gate that faces east. And the man of God says, hey, come to this gate, and I want you to look out. And so as he looks out, he hears a tidal wave, a rush of many waters, and suddenly everything begins to glow. The glory of God has come. And as this comes through, he falls on his face. Verse 4, the glory of God came into the temple by the way of the gate, which faces towards the east. The Spirit lifts him up, and then God comes in. In verse 7, he sits on his throne. Now, for us, we would say that would be cool to watch, right? For a Jewish person, especially a priest, this is big news. And I feel like I bring this up a lot. This may be the only Hebrew you know because it's what I talk about all the time. The word spirit in our language, can talk about, usually it refers to the supernatural, but it also in Old English speaks of wind. And that's because that's the way the Bible is used. That's the way the word's used in the Bible. Think of John 3. John 3, Jesus begins talking about the Spirit. You must be born of water and Spirit in order to see the kingdom of God, right? John chapter 3, verse 5, right? And he says, the Spirit, you don't see it coming and you don't see it leaving, but you feel its effect on you. You feel the breeze, and unless you live like in a desert or somewhere, if you see the rain, you don't see wind, you just feel wind. And Jesus says that's what the Spirit's like. That word pneuma in the Greek means wind or it means spirit. So, if you have pneumonia, that's a disease of the wind. If you have a pneumatic tool, it's a tool that uses air, right? And so pneuma is that word. In the Old Testament, it's the word harak, okay? H-U-A-R-A-C-K, which is a terrible transliteration, but that's how we'll do it, harak. And that is the wind of God. And so many times when someone experiences God's presence, they find it in a wind that comes, okay? Now, when God made Adam out of dirt, right? He was just a mound of dirt. What did God do to make him come to life? Okay, he winded him. He breathed his spirit into man. That's what makes you different than your kitty cat and your dog. People say, hey, I want to see my dog in heaven. And I agree with that. No cats are going to heaven because they're mean, right? Now, last time I said that, somebody was mad at me. And maybe your cat is nice. I don't know how. Your cat has you fooled, okay? What makes you different than a goat, than a bull, than a cat, than an eagle? People are different because they retain within them the breath of God. You're made in God's image. God has breathed into you. Now, this is neat in the book of Ezekiel because at the very beginning, remember Ezekiel works like a seesaw. Everything in the front ends up in the back. It all balances. In Ezekiel 10 and Ezekiel 11, God takes Ezekiel by vision back to the physical temple. And he sees people worshiping false gods. He sees people committing fornication within its walls. He sees people who are drinking blood and doing every terrible thing in the world. And when he sees all that, God says, that's the reason I can't dwell here. And so the Spirit begins to blow and the cloud or the wind leaves. Now that the temple is restored, now that everything is made perfect, the wind blows from the east, and now God has come and he dwells within his temple. Now, you might say, well, okay, that's good. That's all right. Really, God dwells everywhere. So what are we really saying? God proved to the Israelites as they traveled through the wilderness of his presence as by, remember, the fire at night and the cloud or the wind during the day. Whenever somebody would attack them, like the Egyptian army, God would stand between them and their enemies. God's presence was always there, protecting them and guiding them wherever they went. For an Israelite, if you lost God's presence, if God wasn't there for you, you had no hope. And it was well known by them, you lose God, you've lost everything. And now here is Ezekiel. He spent his time, all of his life, out here at the River Kidron, the refugee camp. But he's able to see, with his dying breath, if you will, we're at the end of his life, God's back with his people. God's presence is here once again, and God will always, always be there for us. And so it's pretty neat to see that. Now, he declares he'll never leave again, and of course, when we get to chapter 44, what's neat is God seals the east gate. In other words, he says, I'm never going to use this door again. I'm staying in here forever. I am always going to be with my people, and I'm always going to be here at this point. And so as you go through the rest of 43, you see again about the priest of Zadok, and you see retelling, if you will, of Numbers 21 and of Leviticus. The Levites are going to be doing their jobs again. Everything is going back to the way it was before, which would be absolutely wonderful for him to see as he goes through this. All right, the priesthood is restored. Now go to chapter 45. In chapter 45, we start seeing some geography, if you will. The land is going to be divided, and there's going to be squares of land, okay? And there's 25,000 cubits long and 10,000 cubits wide. It's going to be the holy place. And there's land outside of the temple area. Some is reserved for the prince of Zadok, or the priest of Zadok. Some is reserved for the priests. Some is reserved for the Levites. On either side, there's some room there left for the prince. And the prince is going to grow the things which many people would be sacrificing upon the altar, which would be done. And he's going to go through and he's going to work on getting that done. And so that's the first of the interesting things. And then as you keep going, you're going to notice, especially in verse 18, sacrifices are going to take place. Now, here's the issue if you make this the church. Because are there daily sacrifices for our sins in the church? The Catholics celebrate a thing called Mass. Okay, I don't mean to offend anybody who's Catholic. They celebrate a thing called Mass. Latin means death, right? And so their teaching is a teaching of transubstantiation, that every time that they eat of the bread and every time they drink of the vine, Christ dies again for them. How many times does the Bible teach us that Christ died? Once for all, right? He died once, and that covered all the sins of the people in the past, covered the sins of the people living at that time, and covered the sins of the people in the future. So, does there need to be any more sacrifice? If you got a question about that, read Hebrews 9, right? Okay, one sacrifice. The blood of bulls and goats cannot take away sin, but life is in the blood, Leviticus 17:11, and that blood which was shed by Christ is what atones us and redeems us from our sin, 1 Peter chapter 1. Well, here you see sacrifices taking place. They're going to prepare this altar. They sacrifice a bull, then they sacrifice a goat, and they sacrifice a ram. And you see each day they sacrifice something, and then you see that this sacrifice begins to happen daily, just like it did during the days of Solomon. As you go through, the worship is restored, and it goes back pretty close to what you see in Leviticus. So you see all that is restored. Now, fun stuff, chapter 47. Chapter 47, you go back, they've finally made it all around the temple. And you come back to chapter 47, and he looks again at that east gate. Remember, it's been sealed or never open again. And as he looks close, there's water. And there's water flowing underneath it. Now, is there water anywhere around the temple? No, it's on a mountain. It's up on a hill. The water is flowing. And the messenger of God says, look at this water, let's follow it. And so they follow it, and the water gets bigger and bigger. They get outside of the city, and they walk in it, and it comes up to their ankles. Finally, it comes up to their knees, and finally it comes up to their waist. And as they begin looking at the water, even though this is placed in a desert, because of what the Babylonians had done, and earliers had done as well, there's trees. Vegetation is growing. And this vegetation is awesome. Okay? Right now is one of my favorite times in gardening because strawberries are coming out. We grow a bunch of strawberries. Don't listen to this part, Rhonda. You never know it because they never reach my house, because every time I'm out there, I eat them all. Okay? I love the strawberry time, but the strawberry time's only worth a month, maybe. I love tomato time, but tomato time's only a few months. I love watermelon time, right? But that only comes one time a year. As you look through here, these trees are producing fruit every single month. And the people are being fed by what's coming, flowing from the temple here. That living water of life. Now, you think John's going to take that and do something with it in the book of Revelation? He sure is. He absolutely is. And he's going to explain it a little bit better in terms of what talks about Jesus and the church and things such as that. But what Ezekiel sees is this neat water which is coming from it, and how wonderful and good it is and all the things that it's producing. And it flows down to the Dead Sea. Now, the marshes of the Dead Sea still produce salt because they need salt to live. But everywhere else, it is life-giving, it's fresh, it's good, and it makes everything wonderful, and everything is great. Now, also, as you're hanging out here in 47, we're going to have the borders of the division of the land. And as you go through there, I guess it's chapter 48, it's interesting. It looks like the early part of America. You know, remember Virginia went all the way across, and the Carolinas went all the way across. When the British were making their colonies, they were greedy for more land, so they didn't stop their colony at the Appalachians, even though that's actually where it started. They said it's between this, and it goes on and on for perpetuity. That's what you see here in Ezekiel. You see each tribe has land from east to west, and it never ends. And they're stacked one on top of the other. And something interesting, which John will work with again in the book of Revelation, you don't have Ephraim and Manasseh. Those two are combined into the tribe of Joseph because the Levites are given land as well. So in Ezekiel's mind, what you see is God has taken his people back, given them a better temple, given them a better way of sacrifice, given them better land. He is going to make it better than it was. So that's a quick overview of everything that you see here and everything that is awesome. But come to chapter 48, verse 35. Okay? 48:35. And you see one of the really neat names of God. Okay? God has many different names as you come through Scripture. Jehovah Jireh, Jehovah, or whatever. Now people like to say Yahweh this, Yahweh Shiva, or whatever. Okay. The city from that day, the name of the city is going to be Yahweh Shammah, or Jehovah Shammah. Now what that means, God is there. Now there's been an emphasis through the whole book, 92 times in 48 chapters. You've read the phrase, these people are going to know that I'm the Lord. Then they will know that I am the Lord. 92 times. Remember back when this book was written, people, the vast majority of people could not read. And so what you're hearing is an oral reading of the book. And so imagine if you're sitting somewhere and someone says a phrase over and over, it's going to stand out to you, isn't it? And as Ezekiel's running through the book, talking about why they're in captivity and talking about the death of his wife and talking about the evilness of the priest and talking about this and that, God keeps saying, they're going to know I'm God by the time I'm done with this. They will know that I am the Lord. But once they get to the end, the last they will know I'm the Lord, just chapter 39. Once they get to the end, there's a promise. And that promise is God is with you. God is with you. Now, what does that mean and why is that such a big deal? When Daniel and his 3 friends were captured, they were abused, they were taken to Babylon, what happened to their names? They changed it from a name talking about Jehovah or Yahweh to a name talking about a Baal god, a god of Babylon. Their food got changed. Now, in Daniel 1, they figured out a way around that. Their language got changed. Everything was different. Ezekiel was different because he was living in a refugee camp. He wasn't in the city. But you show up and you start telling people, hey, my God is great. My God created the world. Man, you know, my God, David destroyed Goliath. People would say, well, if your God's so great, why are you here as a slave? Why are you here in a refugee camp? And so over and over, they'd say, well, God has left us. God's not here. How can you prove God is with you when your whole world is falling apart? What you see here is a promise. God is with you. God is there. Jehovah Shammah or Yahweh Shammah. Okay? Now you see that in the New Testament? Hebrews 13, 4 and 5, now he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Therefore, what shall I fear? What can man do to me? How about Matthew 28, 20? And lo, I am with you until the end of the age, right? Jesus has made a promise. Until the end of this age, he will always be with us. Now, that is an exclamation point at the end of this book. This is one of the huge crescendos of the Old Testament. God has promised to be with his people, to restore his people, to always remain with his people. And you see that going all the way into the New Testament. Now, there's a graft in the olive tree, right? Remember that in Romans 9 and 10, where the Gentiles and the Jews, the two become one, Ephesians 2:14. But God is always with his church. The church will stand forever. And God's people shall always, always reign supreme. Okay. God kept his promise to restore Israel. God keeps every single one of his promises to us today, right? Titus 1:2, God cannot lie. The house of the Lord, or the temple of the Lord, is his church and his people. Christ is the head of the church. And God is always with those who are faithful.